Household items were moving around without reason, wounds and bruises that never stopped appearing, and finally the headless animals on the farm, whose bodies would occasionally be found around the house. These events started 10 days ago, turning Barbara's life into a terrifying nightmare. Just a couple of days after these occurrences began, Andrew, Barbara's husband, with whom she had been having conflicts, left the house for good. Now Barbara, who was living alone on their farm, was sure that someone was coming and going in her house at night, someone she couldn't see. What scared her the most was the deep well behind the house, a dry, unused well, covered with a large board. Barbara had noticed that some nights the cover would be moved aside, the same nights the animals were decapitated and the household items shifted. Barbara's fear of the well behind the farm was for all the good reasons. 5 years earlier, when Barbara and her family moved to the farm, they heard terrifying stories about people who died while digging the well and whose bodies were never found. Some even believed that at night they could hear the moaning of these people trying to escape from the well. Barbara wasn't superstitious and had never believed these tales, but now there was no doubt that there was a connection between the well and the strange events happening in the house. This is what Barbara told her youngest daughter, Ruth, who was studying at a university in a nearby town, when she called her and asked her to come stay with her for a while. Barbara was certainly imagining things. That was Ruth's first thought, especially since she knew that her mother had started drinking and taking antidepressants months earlier when she discovered her husband's infidelity. But 2 nights later, when Ruth returned home, she encountered a strange scene. The door was open, and there was no sign of Barbara, yet the house looked exactly as her mother had described it. Chairs were moved or had fallen over, and one of the cabinet drawers was wide open. It wasn't long before the howling of Caesar, the farm's guard dog, who seemed terrified, caught her attention. Ruth hurried outside, and as she searched the surroundings with her phone's flashlight, calling for her mother, she headed towards Caesar's cries. Before long, the light-colored dress Barbara was wearing appeared among the bent stalks of corn under the beam of Ruth's flashlight. Ruth called out to her mother, but Barbara paid her no attention. The closer Ruth got, the more she noticed how strange her mother looked. Barbara was sitting on the ground, mercilessly cutting off their dog's head with a knife in her hand. Ruth, horrified, begged her mother to stop, but Barbara seemed not to hear her at all. A little while later, Barbara stood up and, in a trance-like state, stared into the darkness ahead of her. Ruth shone the light into the darkness, but saw no one. However, when she turned the light back towards her mother, her blood ran cold with fear, for Barbara was now standing right in front of her, staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. It didn't take long for Ruth to understand what was happening. Ruth recognized her mother's emotionless gaze all too well. Barbara had a history of sleepwalking since childhood, and although she had recovered for years, the sleepwalking had returned due to her alcohol and medication use. Ruth now knew the reason for the displaced household items and the wounds and bruises on her mother's body. All of it happened while she was asleep, without her remembering any of it. Ruth knew she shouldn't wake her mother during these episodes, so she tried to lead Barbara back to the house without alarming her. But as soon as she tried to take her mother's hand, she felt a sharp pain in her throat. Ruth stared in disbelief and shock as her mother drove the knife she was holding into her throat. Blood gushed from Ruth's neck. She clutched her throat, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Barbara sat on her chest and repeatedly stabbed her in the chest and face without realizing what she was doing. A few minutes later, as Barbara dragged Ruth's bloody body across the ground, Ruth was still alive and tried weakly to call out to her mother to wake her, but her voice was too faint to succeed. When they reached the well, Barbara removed the board covering it and, without any emotion, threw Ruth inside. Ruth's last futile effort was scratching Barbara's leg with her nails before falling into the well. Ruth was taking her final breaths, suffocating in the stench within the well, a stench that came not only from the carcasses of the animals her mother had slaughtered, but also from another corpse in the well, her father, Andrew. Contrary to what Ruth and her mother believed, Andrew had never left the house but had been killed by Barbara. On the first night her sleepwalking episodes began. Andrew's smashed face, beaten by multiple blows from a rock, was the last image that imprinted itself on Ruth's mind. The next day, when Barbara woke up, she faced a familiar scene, a wound on her leg, the cause of which she didn't know, along with household items scattered around. But the real horror awaited her outside. The board covering the well had been moved aside again, and not far from it, Caesar's headless body lay on the ground in a pool of dried blood. Terrified, Barbara quickly grabbed the phone and called Ruth. After a few rings, the call went to voicemail. With fear and tears, Barbara left a message asking why Ruth hadn't come home yet and why she had left her alone, unaware that the night before she had killed her daughter in her sleep and thrown her body into the well she so feared.